My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 41 years old, and I have spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to read silence the way other people read faces. I am an estate attorney. I specialize in wills, trusts, and the particular grief of families, discovering, after a death, exactly how little they meant to someone. You would think this job would make me cynical about families. It did the opposite. It made me patient. It taught me that the truth always surfaces eventually, usually in a conference room, usually too late for anyone to do anything about it, except sign where indicated. I am telling you this because patience is the only reason I am alive to tell this story, calmly, instead of bitterly. I waited a long time to understand my mother, and on the night of her 40th wedding anniversary, in a ballroom full of candlelight and rented flowers, I finally did. I want to start there, at the party, because that is the night everything ended, not began. The beginning came decades earlier, but endings are easier to recognize. So let me give you the ending first. The Stratford Hotel ballroom holds 200 people comfortably. My mother, Diane, had invited 300 because comfort was never the point. Spectacle was. Round tables draped in ivory linen. A string quartet that her husband, my stepfather Richard, had hired against her wishes because she'd wanted a DJ and he'd wanted something with dignity. And somehow, as always, what Richard wanted simply became what happened. I sat at table 6 between my husband Marcus and my mother's cousin Phyllis, who spent the appetizer course telling me about her knee replacement in more anatomical detail than I required. I had flown in from Chicago 2 days earlier. I'd taken time off from a firm that does not easily grant time off. I'd helped Diane's wedding planner reprint 40 seating cards because of a font error. I'd personally driven to 3 florists when the centerpiece order fell through. I had given this woman, my mother, 4 days of my finite life, and I want to be honest. I did not do it because I expected gratitude. I had stopped expecting gratitude from Diane around the time I turned 12. I did it because some part of me, even at 41, still operated on the theory that enough quiet competence would eventually be noticed. It is a slow education, unlearning that theory. The toasts began after the main course. Richard went first. Warm, a little long-winded. The kind of speech where you can tell a man genuinely loves his wife, but has never once examined why. Then my half-brother, Tyler, who is 11 years younger than me and Richard's biological son, gave a toast that made the room laugh and cry in the right places. The kind of toast that gets shared as a video afterward. Tyler is, to be fair to him, not a cruel person. He is simply a person who has never had to be anything other than beloved, and it shows in everything he does, including his easy, unburdened generosity. Then my mother stood up to speak. She thanked the guests, thanked the staff, thanked Richard for rescuing her. Her word, from what she called smiling out at the room, a difficult chapter. And then she said, still smiling, her eyes finding me at table 6 the way a hawk finds movement in tall grass. And of course, none of this would have been possible without my children. Tyler, who has been the light of my life since the day he was born. A pause, warm laughter. And Eleanor, another pause, this one different, the kind of pause a comedian uses before a punchline. Eleanor, who has always been so capable. She said the word the way you describe a piece of furniture. Sturdy, functional. I used to worry, when she was young, that she'd never really know how to be loved, the way Tyler does. Some people just have that gift. But she found Marcus, bless him, and he seems happy enough. Laughter again, a ripple of it, uncertain but present, because 200 people had decided collectively that this was meant to be funny, and laughter is contagious, even when its target is sitting in the room. I did not move. I want you to understand that. I did not gasp, did not flush, did not do any of the things people do in movies. I have spent my whole career sitting across tables from people delivering devastating news in flat, procedural voices. And I have learned to receive devastating news the same way. I simply looked at her, and I felt something in my chest settle into place, like a key turning in a lock that had been jammed for 30 years. Marcus's hand found mine under the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had heard in 11 years of marriage enough stories about Diane to know exactly what this was. Not an aberration, but a culmination. My mother went on for another minute. Something about love enduring. Something about Richard being her true partner in every sense. And then she sat down to applause, and the band started up again. And the room moved on the way rooms do, because most people in that ballroom did not know they had just watched something important happen. They thought they'd watched a slightly awkward joke at a wedding anniversary. They had actually watched the final entry in a ledger I had been keeping, without quite admitting it to myself, since I was 9 years old. I'm going to take you back now, because you cannot understand why that one sentence broke something that 30 years of smaller cruelties had not, unless you understand the 30 years. My parents divorced when I was 7. My father, a quiet man named Gerald, who taught high school physics and built furniture in the garage on weekends, was not a dramatic person, and his departure from our lives was not dramatic either. It was a slow fade, custody weekends that grew further apart. Then, phone calls that grew shorter then. By the time I was 14, a man I mostly knew through birthday cards with $20 bills folded inside. I do not think my mother forced this distance. Exactly. I think she simply never built any bridges to maintain it, and my father was not the kind of man who built bridges on his own. I loved him in the abstract, the way you love a country you were born in but never visited. My mother married Richard when I was 9. Richard is a successful man, a regional manager for a logistics company, comfortable, conventional, the kind of man who believed deeply in the idea of family without ever quite noticing the particular family he had. He was not unkind to me. That is important to say, because this is not a story about a wicked stepfather. Richard simply organized his attention the way most people organize a budget. Necessities first. Tyler, his biological son, born when I was 11, was a necessity. I was something more like a recurring subscription he'd inherited and didn't quite remember canceling. The shape of my childhood, after that, was the shape of being slightly outside a frame. I have 100 small memories that, individually, mean nothing. The school play where my mother arrived 20 minutes late because she'd been at Tyler's soccer practice. And Tyler didn't even have a game that day, just practice. The Christmas when I was 13 and unwrapped a sweater 2 sizes too small, while Tyler, 6, unwrapped a bicycle, and my mother said, laughing, "Eleanor doesn't really care about presents. She's so practical." I had never said this. I had simply learned, by then, not to show wanting, because wanting visibly seemed to embarrass her. The memory that I returned to most, though, the one I think actually built the foundation under everything else, happened when I was 9, only months after the wedding to Richard. I had gotten the highest score in my school district on a statewide math exam. A genuine achievement, the kind that came with a letter from the superintendent and a small plaque. I remember running home with the letter, the particular electric joy of a child who has done something undeniably good and is about to be seen for it. My mother read the letter at the kitchen counter while stirring something on the stove. She said, "That's nice, sweetheart." And then, without looking up, "Richard's bringing his sister over for dinner. Can you set the table for 6 instead of 4? That was all. That was the entire response. I set the table for 6. I put the letter on the refrigerator myself, with a magnet shaped like a strawberry, and it stayed there for 1 week before it disappeared during a kitchen reorganization, and nobody mentioned it again. And I never mentioned it again either, because some early, sharp instinct in me understood that bringing it up would only confirm something I did not want confirmed, that it had never mattered to her at all. I do not tell you this to make you feel sorry for a 9-year-old. Children survive worse than an unread plaque. I tell you this because it was the first entry in the ledger, the moment I began, without realizing it, to keep score, not out of vengefulness, out of self-protection. If I could predict what would and wouldn't reach her, I could stop racing for things that would never come. Here is what I learned, cataloging those years. My mother was not a monster. Monsters are easier in some ways because you can hate them cleanly. My mother was something more common and more difficult. A woman who had decided, somewhere in her own childhood, that love was a finite resource to be allocated strategically, and who had allocated nearly all of hers to the version of family that flattered her, the golden son, the doting husband, the wedding anniversary toasts. I existed in her accounting as proof that she had survived a difficult chapter, a phrase I heard her use about her first marriage, about my father, about the years that included my birth, more times than I can count. I was the evidence of the hard years. Tyler was the reward for getting through them. It is a brutal kind of arithmetic to grow up inside, and the cruelest part is how invisible it is from outside the family, how easily it reads, to strangers, as nothing more than a mother who's a little harder on her oldest. I left for college at 18 and did not come home except for obligatory holidays. I built a life. Law school, then the firm, then Marcus, who I met at 28 and married at 30. A structural engineer with a steadiness that I had apparently been starving for without knowing its name. Marcus's family is large and loud and imperfect in ordinary ways. They argue about politics at dinner and forget birthdays sometimes. But underneath the imperfection is a baseline assumption I had never experienced before meeting them. That everyone at the table matters equally. The first time Marcus's mother remembered, unprompted, a deposition I'd mentioned once in passing, and asked how it had gone, I went to the bathroom and cried for 4 minutes, because I did not have language yet for how foreign that felt. I kept calling Diane. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as one where I was simply a victim who eventually escaped, and that is not quite honest. I called her every Sunday for years. I visited twice a year. I sent the careful, dutiful gestures of a daughter trying to keep a connection alive through sheer maintenance. The way you keep an old car running past the point it makes financial sense. Because some part of you isn't ready to admit the relationship is the thing breaking down, not the parts. She would ask about my work in the vague way people ask about things they don't understand and don't want explained. She would talk at length about Tyler, his job in sales, his girlfriend, later his fiancée, the house he and his fiancée were buying with help from Richard, that nobody framed as help because in that house, help flowing to Tyler was simply called love. While the one time I'd asked, at 26, for a small loan to cover bar exam costs after a financial setback, my mother had said gently that she didn't want to enable me, that I needed to learn to stand on my own. I did stand on my own. I want that on the record, too. I am not asking anyone to feel sorry for the outcome. I am only naming the asymmetry, because the asymmetry is the whole story. The anniversary invitation arrived 8 months before the party, a thick ivory card with calligraphy, and I remember standing in my kitchen reading it and feeling something I can only describe as cautious hope, the particular, embarrassing hope of someone who has been disappointed many times but has not yet run out of the capacity to hope anyway. 40 years is a long marriage. Surely, I thought, a milestone like this would soften something. Surely there would be space, finally, for me to be seen as something other than the difficult chapter evidence. I flew in early. I worked the seating chart. I drove to 3 florists. I did all of this, again, not for praise, but because some part of me, the part that had set the table for 6 at 9 years old, still believed that competence might eventually be recognized as a form of love if I just performed it well enough, for long enough, in front of enough witnesses. And then she stood up in front of 300 people and called me capable, and said she'd worried I would never know how to be loved. And the room laughed, and something in me that had been bending under 32 years of small, quiet weight simply stopped bending. It did not snap dramatically. It is more accurate to say it set down. The way you finally set down a bag you've been carrying so long, your arm forgot it was heavy. I did not make a scene at the party. I finished my meal. I danced one dance with Marcus, a slow, unhurried dance, during which he held me a little tighter than the song required and said nothing, because he understood, by then, that I needed the dignity of not discussing it yet. I hugged Richard goodbye, because Richard, in his oblivious way, had never been unkind to me, only incurious, and I did not have a grievance large enough to extend to him. I did not hug my mother. I shook her hand. I watched her register that, a small flicker of confusion crossing her face, the first crack in 32 years of assuming I would always eventually come back around. And then I said, "Congratulations on 40 years." And Marcus and I left. In the car, Marcus asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said, not yet. We drove back to the hotel in a silence that was not angry. It was the silence of someone doing math, totaling a column of figures she had been avoiding for a very long time. I want to tell you what I decided that night, because I think the decision itself matters more than the speech that triggered it. I did not decide to confront my mother. I did not decide to write her a letter explaining in careful legal prose every grievance from age 9 forward. I considered it in the lawyer part of my brain that wants every injustice documented and answered for, but I rejected it almost immediately because I understood something essential. My mother was not going to be moved by an accounting of harm. She had never once in 32 years demonstrated the capacity to receive that kind of accounting without turning it into evidence of my ingratitude, my coldness, my inability, there was that word again, to be loved properly. Confrontation would simply become another data point she could narrate to her friends. Eleanor had an outburst at the anniversary. You know how she gets. So I decided something quieter and, I think, more final. I decided to disappear. Not dramatically, not with a slammed door or a public severing. I am not a person who believes in burning things down. I believe, professionally and personally, in clean documentation and clear boundaries, the kind that hold up because they are calm rather than because they are loud. I decided I would simply, gradually, stop showing up. No more Sunday calls. No more biannual visits. No more flying in early to fix seating charts. I would respond to direct communication with politeness and brevity, the way you'd respond to a former colleague you bore no ill will toward, but had no reason to maintain a relationship with. I would not announce this as a punishment. I would not give her the speech. I would simply remove myself, the way you remove your hand from a stove, not with rage, but with the calm, immediate logic of self-preservation. It took her 5 weeks to notice. I know this because she called on a Sunday, our old, unbroken ritual. And when I didn't answer, she didn't call again for 5 weeks. I do not know what that gap means exactly. Perhaps she assumed I was busy. Perhaps some part of her clocked the shift and decided not to examine it too closely, the way you avoid looking directly at a check engine light. When she finally called again, I let it go to voicemail, and her message was breezy, unbothered. Eleanor, haven't heard from you in a while. Hope work isn't keeping you too busy. Call me when you get a chance. Nothing in it suggested she'd registered the handshake instead of a hug, the early departure, the months of silence. I did not call back that week, or the next. I want to walk you through what happened over the following year, because the texture of it matters. This wasn't a single clean break, but a slow, deliberate unwinding, and I think the slowness is what eventually made it impossible for her to dismiss. 3 months in, she emailed. An actual email, formal for her, which told me she understood something was wrong, even if she couldn't name it. The email was 3 sentences. It said she hoped I wasn't upset about anything she'd said at the party, that she'd only been teasing, and that she missed talking to me. I read it twice. I noticed, the way I notice contractual language for a living, the construction of that sentence. Hoped I wasn't upset about anything she'd said, rather than I'm sorry for what I said. It was an apology shaped like a question, designed so that if I didn't respond, she could tell herself she'd reached out and I had simply chosen not to engage, rather than that she had caused something requiring repair. I did not respond. 5 months in, Tyler called me. This surprised me. Tyler and I had a perfectly pleasant, perfectly shallow relationship, the kind built on family obligation rather than chosen closeness, and he had never once in 30 years called me to discuss anything emotional. He was awkward about it, which I appreciated. It told me he wasn't acting as Diane's envoy, so much as genuinely confused. "Mom says you're avoiding her," he said. "Is everything okay?" I told him, honestly and without theatrics, that I needed some space and that it wasn't his concern and that I appreciated him checking in. He said, "She seems really thrown by it, actually. I've never seen her like this." I remember feeling something complicated at that. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of confirmation. She was thrown. The wedding planner, who had never noticed my absence at her son's actual childhood, was, apparently, capable of noticing my absence now. It told me something about what she'd actually been relying on me for all those years. Not love, not connection, but availability. I had been a fixture. Fixtures, when removed, leave a noticeable gap on the wall, even if no one ever looked at them directly while they hung there. 7 months in, Richard called, the first time, in 32 years of his being my stepfather, that he had ever called me on his own initiative. I want to give him this. He was kind, and he was honest, in a way that surprised me. He said, "I'm not going to pretend I always understood what was going on between you two. I probably should have paid more attention over the years, but your mother's not herself lately. I don't know what happened at the party, but whatever it is, it landed." I told him I appreciated the call, and that I wasn't angry at him, and that this wasn't something a phone call could fix. He said he understood, and I believed him. And we have, since then, maintained a small, careful, separate relationship. Birthday texts, the occasional call, built on the understanding that he was not the one I was protecting myself from. It was around the 9-month mark that I learned, through Tyler, that my mother had started seeing a therapist. I felt no triumph at this. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy telling this story. To perform vindication, I did not actually feel. What I felt was something closer to grief, the recognition that it had taken 32 years and one viral adjacent humiliation at a wedding anniversary to produce a single session of professional self-examination, and that even now, I had no real evidence it would lead anywhere. I have watched, in my career, dozens of families discover too late that insight without accountability changes nothing. A person can understand exactly why they hurt someone and still, functionally, never repair it, because understanding is comfortable and repair is expensive. At the 1-year mark, almost exactly, she wrote me a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, 4 pages, which arrived at my office because she did not, I think, trust herself to send it to the house where Marcus might see it first, and ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. I have read that letter more times than I can count, and I am not going to reproduce all 4 pages here, but I will tell you what was true in it, and what I believe, even now, was not. She wrote that she had thought, for most of my childhood, that treating me with brisk competence rather than open affection was a kind of respect, that she had believed, somewhere along the way, that I was the strong one and didn't need the same softness Tyler needed, and that she understood now, after a year of therapy and a year of my absence, that this had been a story she'd told herself to avoid the harder work of examining why affection came so much easier with him than with me. She wrote about her own mother, my grandmother, a woman I barely remembered, who had been by all accounts cold and conditional with her love. And she connected dots I had never had the full picture to connect myself. That she had married my father young, partly to escape that house, and that some part of her had always associated me, her first child, born during what she called the hardest years of my life, with the very things she'd been trying to escape, even though, she wrote, none of that was ever your fault, and I am ashamed it took me this long to say so. That paragraph, I will admit, undid something in me, not all at once and not completely, but it gave me, for the first time, an actual explanation rather than just an absence. The difference between a closed door and a door that was simply never built. It did not erase the ledger. It did not retroactively read the math letter at age 9, or buy the sweater that fit, or notice the plaque before it disappeared from the refrigerator. But it was the first time, in 32 years, that my mother had described her own failure in language that didn't shift the weight back onto me. No, you've always been so sensitive. No, I was only teasing. Just an account, a true one, as far as I could tell, of her own limitations. I did not write back immediately. I sat with the letter for 3 weeks, which I recognize is its own kind of professional habit. I do not sign anything, in my work or my life, until I have read it slowly enough to know what I am actually agreeing to. When I finally responded, I did not write 4 pages. I wrote 1. I told her that I believed she meant what she'd written, and that I appreciated the honesty more than she could probably understand, but that an apology, however sincere, is the beginning of a process and not the end of one. That 32 years cannot be settled by 4 pages, no matter how true those pages are. I told her I was willing to begin building something new, slowly, with no promise of how far it would go, and that I needed her to understand this would not look like what she remembered. Sunday calls, biannual visits, the dutiful daughter showing up to fix seating charts. It would look like whatever actual trust could be rebuilt, at whatever pace that took, and that I would not be available to perform closeness that hadn't been earned yet. She wrote back a single line. I understand. Thank you for telling me the truth, instead of just walking away for good. I know I would have deserved that too. That sentence, I know I would have deserved that too, is, I think, the closest I have ever come to actually believing. My mother understood me as a separate person with a legitimate grievance, rather than as a function in the story of her own difficult chapter. It has been 2 years now since the anniversary. I will tell you honestly that the relationship Diane and I have rebuilt is not the relationship I once fantasized about as a child, setting the table for 6. It is not warm in the unthinking, effortless way I watched her be warm with Tyler my whole life. It is careful. It is, in some ways, the relationship of 2 people who have agreed to a long and unhurried negotiation, checking in with each other periodically about whether the terms still hold. We talk every few weeks now, not every Sunday. I visit once a year, not twice, and I no longer arrive early to manage logistics nobody asked me to manage. When she introduces me to people now, she does not say, capable. Last spring, at Tyra's wedding, where I sat at table 6 again, almost like a private joke the universe was playing on me, she introduced me to a stranger as my daughter, the attorney, who is far smarter than the rest of us put together. And I noticed the way you notice the first warm day after a long winter that I did not feel the old electric need for it to be true. I simply noted that she had said something kind in public without it costing her anything to say. It was a small thing. I have learned slowly, painfully, and I think permanently that families like mine are built almost entirely out of small things, and that the absence of 1,000 small things over 32 years cannot be undone by one large gesture. It has to be rebuilt the same way it broke, incrementally, in the unglamorous accumulation of ordinary days. I think often in my work about the families who come to me after a death, discovering in a will exactly how a parent valued them, the unequal distributions, the conditions attached to inheritance, the small cruelties encoded in legal language, because the parent could not or would not say them aloud while alive. I used to think those documents were simply about money. I understand now that they are about something else. They are the final ledger, the last accounting a person ever gives of how they actually saw the people in their life. After decades of saying one thing and meaning another. I think about what my mother's ledger would have looked like had she died before that anniversary speech, before the year of silence, before the 4-page letter. I think it would have looked like the toast. Capable, competent, a footnote beside a beloved son. I am profoundly grateful that I am not waiting for a will to tell me the truth. I made her tell me while she was still alive to mean it. People sometimes ask me, when this story comes up in careful conversation, whether I regret disappearing, whether the silence was too harsh, a response to one bad toast at one party. I understand the instinct behind the question, and I no longer feel defensive answering it. The toast was not the injury. The toast was simply the moment 32 years of smaller injuries finally became visible enough, in front of enough witnesses, that I could no longer perform the alternative, the pretending, the setting of tables for 6, the quiet hope that competence would eventually be recognized as love. I did not disappear to punish my mother. I disappeared because I had finally run out of the particular, exhausting hope that had kept me showing up for 32 years, and in its absence, I discovered something I had never had room to notice before. How much quieter, how much more spacious my own life could be without that hope constantly asking something of me. What came after? The letter, the therapy, the slow rebuilding, that was a gift, and I do not take it for granted because I know, professionally and personally, how rarely it happens. Most of the families I see in my office never get the 4-page letter. They get a will, read aloud in a conference room, and they get to sit with whatever truth is finally, unavoidably, on the page. I got mine while there was still time to answer it. That, I have come to believe, is the actual ending of this story. Not the silence, and not even the letter, but the fact that for the first time in my life, my mother and I are building something based on what is actually true, rather than what was convenient to believe. It is smaller than what I once wanted. It is also, I have learned, the only kind of love that holds.